All right, well, I am going to call it and get started here just as a couple more people are jumping in. I'm Amanda with Procedureflow, and I am super, super excited today to introduce Jeff Toister. For those of you who don't know, Jeff is a nationally recognized speaker, trainer, and he is actually the author of 3 different books on customer service. So we are just super, super excited to have him here with us today. He, as you know, is going to be talking to us about some different ways to help you cut your new hire training time. And then we'll finish off this webinar with a couple minutes with our VP of Product Management, Micah Peterson. And with that, I will hand things over to Jeff to get started.
All right. Thank you, Amanda. I really appreciate both you and Micah having me here today. I'm going to start by giving you the promise of what we're going to talk about in our webinar, and then we're going to jump right in, roll up our sleeves. You'll notice my contact information is right there on the screen. If you'd like to know more, you have questions for me, please send them my way. We've reserved some time at the end of this webinar for your questions. So think about whether it's a technical question, more nuts and bolts, something just basic, or something you're working on. We're here to support you. The idea is you take something from today's webinar and go use it right away. So let's talk about how to dramatically cut new hire training time. And just to very briefly give you some perspective, the first time I did this was over 20 years ago. I was working as a contact center training supervisor, and the mandate was cut new hire training time. And that was all I was really given. And I had to figure out how to do it. I was lucky that I had a really good mentor, and I was lucky that I had a natural inclination to experiment. So I stumbled into some techniques, and we ended up cutting our training time significantly. Over the years, I've worked with other organizations, other contact centers, and I've helped contact centers consistently cut new hire training time by 50%. That's in half. And the best part is, at the end of the new, shorter program, the results were even better. And that's what I'd like to share with you today, exactly how you can do that as well. So to get started, I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of math. I apologize. Not everybody likes math. Maybe you do, so that'll be okay. But I want you to calculate your current new hire training time. So you might need a calculator or the calculator app on your phone. But here's what I want you to factor in. And in your organization, you might have some different pieces as well. First, how long does new employee orientation take? Now, in some organizations, there's none. Others, it's just a couple of hours. And some, it's 2 days. So you have to factor that in. That's part of the new hire experience. The second question is, if you have formal classroom training, then how long does that take? And I've seen quite the wide range in contact centers. It really depends on who you're hiring, how many people you're hiring, how technical or complicated the job's going to be. But think about how long it is in your organization. And then there's nesting. Now, I know a lot of you are familiar with nesting, but if you are not, what it simply means is we've moved them out of training into kind of a limbo between training and where they're normally going to be sitting and working in the contact center. And we've put them in a special group where they have access to a lot more intensive resources. So they might be with a coach where there's a smaller ratio, maybe one coach to 3 or 5 learners versus one supervisor to 20 agents. So we're giving them a lot more attention. We might even be, during the nesting period, have them do side-by-sides with more experienced agents. And that also blends into that last piece. They're on-the-job learning. So are there things that we might say, well, we've released you from training, but you still need to learn in order to do your job and to do it effectively, and most important, to do it independently. So I want you to think about all the components. I may have missed some that are part of your program, but see if you can come up with a calculation for your new hire training time. Now, in a moment, I'll tell you what the average is for contact centers according to my research. But Amanda, I'm going to ask for your help here. If we could launch a poll, and I want to see what people came up with. So we've got a few different options here. And the question for all of you is, how long is your new hire training? And we're talking about total time, so not just classroom. but total time from day one to they can do their job independently at a minimally competent level, whatever that is. Let me be quiet for just a few seconds and give you a chance to complete the poll. Hopefully we gave everyone enough time to do all the math.
I think so. All right, they've stopped coming in now, so I'm
Okay,
going to close the polling, and I'm going to share the results.
Okay. We have, so I'm pretty pleased by that. We have a pretty advanced group. When I've done my own research on this, the average is closer to 12 weeks, and only 8% of us are saying it's 12 weeks. Most of us are in that 5 to 8 weeks range. 2 to 4 weeks is popular. Now, don't take too much from that, because your job in your contact center that you're training for might be completely different than somebody else who's on the webinar today. The role that they're training for might be a lot more complicated or a lot less complicated. Or we might be using different techniques, and we'll find that today. So that gives us a baseline then. And the techniques I'm going to share with you, if you're doing what I'll call the old way of contact center training, and I'll explain that more in a minute, you can apply these techniques, and whatever your number is, you can cut it in half. So I'm going to close this. Hopefully if I click on it, it disappears. Perfect. And I want to bring us to, I think, a fundamental question that we need to answer when we're training our agents, and that is this: what is a fully trained agent able to do? And I think this is, when I've worked with contact centers to build training programs, this is often a question that hasn't been clearly and comprehensively answered. And the reason we need to know the answer to this question is we need to be able to assess whether or not an agent has actually been trained. But we also need to build our training program around getting our agent to that point. And I'll give you an example. I've worked with contact centers before where they would spend a full day on a topic that the agent would likely not use but once every 6 months. And they might spend just a couple of hours on a topic that the agent uses every single day. So sometimes if we don't have a clear idea of what we're training them to, we're not really able to assess how well we're training them or select even the right content. So, what do we do about this? Well, the first technique I want to share with you is to create performance objectives. And here's where I kind of explain the old way, or the common way that many contact centers are training even today, versus the techniques that will cut your new hire training time. So the old way, there's a couple ways that contact centers have assessed training. In the past, there'll be no assessment at all in some contact centers. So they'll say, well, they're not asking a lot of questions. I think they got it. Or I've worked with clients where they'll give them quizzes. Okay, we gave you a quiz on product knowledge and a quiz on the CRM system and on the phone system. And depending on how people did on the quizzes, that's how we assess the training. Now, the new way to do it, and the way that's going to cut your training time, is to create performance objectives that are based upon the agent's actual job duties. And this allows you to do a couple of things that will become even more apparent in a moment. One, you can assess very clearly whether or not an agent has been trained. And I have to tell you from my experience, not all agents are trainable. Now, it depends on how well you hire people, but in my first contact center training role, we occasionally had people that could not be trained. They simply lacked the capability. We made a mistake when we hired them. It was unfortunate, but we would be doing them a disservice, our company a disservice, and most important, our customers a disservice if we allowed them to pass training anyways. With performance objectives, we could clearly say this person's trained or not. So that's the first benefit. The second benefit is you can cut out irrelevant content and you can add in relevant content. So let me give you a model that you can use to create performance objectives. And as a trainer, I like to use what's called the ABCD model. And you can see this, it's the A equals audience, behavior, B behavior, C conditions, and D degree. So here's a sample of an actual objective that I've used with a contact center training program. It's not the only objective. We had several objectives to assess performance. But here's one sample. Customer service representatives will provide a correct and timely response to a customer inquiry during live calls taken in class 5 times without error. So in other words, they're going to be able to answer customer questions. Now, I want to break this down and show you how we come up with the A, B, C, D. And if you'd like to get more on this tool, you go to my website, toistersolutions.com/tools. You'll be able to find a worksheet that you could download at no charge and be able to create your own A, B, C, D objectives. So let's look at the first one, audience. In this case, customer service representatives. The reason it's important to put the audience in your objective is that you might have a training program where you have different audiences. So I might have a customer service representative 1 or a customer service representative 2, or even different roles. Maybe somebody from accounting is going to take part of our new hire course, but not the full thing. So that's why it's important to specify audience. The B is behavior. What do we want them to do? That's part of this training. And in this case, simply answer a customer's question correctly and do it quickly. C, this is the next part that's very important. The conditions that we're going to assess whether or not they've been trained. And there's different ways to do this. It could be a simulation. In this case, I've added during live calls taken in class. So you can imagine we might be in a classroom environment, but they're real customers. And we have the trainer that's right there to intervene if the learner has any difficulty. And sometimes it's just live calls in the production environment. That's okay too. And then finally, the degree. And the degree simply means how accurate do they have to be. So in this case, we want 5 in a row without error, which means that if they do 4 without error and then the 5th one they make an error, guess what? We go all the way back to the beginning and we've got to get 5 in a row without error before we say they're trained on this. You have to be careful in this sense that there's a balance between making goals too easy to achieve, that it doesn't really reflect what you expect from a fully trained person, and making them too difficult to achieve so that nobody, even your most fully trained and senior agent, could pass the training course. So you have to strike the balance, and often it takes a little trial and error to figure out what's the right level set. An easy way to do this is if you have a contact center monitoring process already, is use that monitoring process to help set your ABCD objectives. In other words, what would you expect someone to get? Maybe it's 80% on a monitored call, or average 80% on 5 monitored calls, or emails, or chats, or whatever you'd like to assess them on. Set something that's reasonable, and you can then clearly identify the performance. So that's the first step, but there's more. This is really table stakes. I'm going to give you 2 more techniques that you can implement right away. For the second one, I want you to imagine that we all work for a company that sells appliances, like kitchen appliances, stoves, refrigerators, microwaves, dishwashers, and we have a product line. It's not our best seller, but it's important to a core group of customers. We sell wine refrigerators or wine storage units. And if a customer calls and asks the question, what is the ideal wine storage temperature? There's 2 ways to give that customer the correct answer. One is you memorize the answer. And that's great if that's all you had to do. But remember, this is not a product you deal with a lot. So because you don't deal with it a lot, it might be really easy to forget the correct answer. So the second way that we can give the correct answer and not have to worry about memorizing it is we can look it up. And so this leads us to the second technique, and that is incorporating a knowledge base into training. So in the typical contact center training programs, even today, they rely a lot on memorization. And the challenge with memorization is it's resource intensive. You have to repeat information over and over and over again for it to stick in your memory, and then you have to use it over and over and over again to keep it there. With a performance approach, which is the new way of looking at it, I don't care if you memorize the answer or if you can look it up. I just want you to give the correct answer quickly. So let's do a little test here. If you have your web browser handy and open, which I know you do, you're probably surfing it right now. Let's go back to that question. What's the ideal wine storage temperature? Now, I'm a huge wine fan. I know exactly what that temperature is. But if you Google it right quick, you're going to get the same answer as well. And Google is a really big knowledge base. It's going to give us the same thing. Chances are, if you Google it, you will get this answer right here, that the ideal temperature is, according to Wine Spectator and many other sources, 55 degrees is considered to be the perfect temperature. Now think of this problem from training your agents. If I have to get them to memorize tons of information, it takes a lot of time and they're very likely to forget it. But if I can give them a knowledge base, maybe a bit more refined and easier to access correct information rather than Google, but something that's specific to our company, to our products, to our procedures. And in the moment, while they're talking to that customer, the customer says, so what's the ideal wine storage temperature? And click, oh, that's a great question. We get that a lot. It's important to store your wine at the right temperature. The answer, now I've got it, right? The answer is 55 degrees. It can be between 45 and 65, but experts say 55 is just about right. If we give our agents access to that information, then we don't need to spend as much time training them on memorizing things. Okay, so that's the first and the second. First is we give them performance objectives that allows us to take out content that's irrelevant, add in content that's sorely needed. The second, we give them access to knowledge base. Now, here's where the magic comes in. This is the third one, and this is the one that might be the newest to many people on the webinar today. But before I do that, I want to ask, this is really important because the third one you really need to have a knowledge base in place. So Amanda, I wonder if we could launch just a quick poll again, just to see how many people in the audience currently have a knowledge base that their agents are able to use.
Yep,
we're not asking how good it is, but just do they have it?
I just launched it, so I just saw a couple people ask some questions about the first one. So
Sure.
I believe you should see something automatically pop up on your screen. If you're only joined by phone, unfortunately, you can't answer. But for everyone else on a computer, you should have a pop-up show up in Zoom. And just while we're giving people a second to answer, Jeff, we do have one question.
Sure.
The ABCD process, is that completed during the training or the nesting period? And how would it tie into that and save time?
So if we go back to the ABC goals, that is, it's not relevant to formal training versus nesting versus any other component. It's the objective that I would use to determine whether or not someone is fully trained. And so it's not relevant to a stage. It's really relevant to what does the person need to do by the time they reach the end, whatever the end is. So I hope that makes some sort of sense to whoever asked the question. There was a second component to it as well. So when is it? And then tell me the next one again.
How does it save time? How does that tie into saving time?
Okay, so it saves you time in a number of ways. First and most important, if I know exactly what someone needs to be trained, then I take out irrelevant content. And a lot of training programs are too long because they simply have too much content. The second piece, though, where it saves time is it enables the other two techniques. So I've shared with you the knowledge-based technique. Having clear objectives allows you to use a knowledge base to drive training. And then in a moment, I'm going to share another technique where it's essential that you have objectives. The third thing is it allows you to quickly assess where a learner is. So for example, if someone's struggling to reach an objective, you can diagnose that a lot faster if you know this is what a fully trained person's look like. You have to be able to answer these types of inquiries, and you're not able to answer these inquiries right now. I know what your gap is immediately. If I don't have objectives, then it's really difficult to diagnose any challenges along the way and fix those. So you can make mid-course corrections while you're training someone if you have objectives. You can't do that easily if you don't have objectives.
And I think, Jeff, you had mentioned as well that if you don't evaluate somebody, like if it's a poor quiz or something like that, the design's not good, and then you just throw them out, they're going to spend more time in nesting and essentially balloon out the onboarding time.
Correct. And that's why I say that nesting versus formal training is not entirely relevant to the objectives, because nesting is usually a byproduct of poor training. Not always, but it's often a byproduct of us not being able to evaluate clearly whether or not someone's trained or not giving them the tools they need in the training program. And I'll explain that more in just a moment. I think our poll's done, though. How do we do on the poll?
Yeah. So I'm just going to share the results right now.
Okay.
So you should be able to see them now.
Hey,
and if anyone does have any other questions, please feel free to type them into the Q&A section.
Some funky math going on here.
I know. I was thinking the same thing, that those numbers don't add up.
Maybe some person figured out how to answer yes and no.
Maybe.
But on the whole, then we say most of us have a knowledge base. So it's something that you can leverage. I want to add, so I want to close this. Thank you, Amanda, for helping with that poll. And this is, I think, an important aspect of using a knowledge base is to integrate your knowledge base into training. And what I mean by that is a lot of contact centers these days are using, say, like a separate e-learning platform where we might simulate some of the knowledge that someone needs to use. But then when they get into a live environment, the knowledge base that they use in a live environment is completely separate from what they've been using in training. And what I'm recommending is that from day one, you use the knowledge base that they're actually going to use on the job. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Reason number one is good training should be as close to the real work as possible. So by having them do something separate, like in a self-contained e-learning, you're actually creating a longer learning curve because they're going to have to learn how to use that new knowledge base anyway. You also have to update that e-learning to make sure that it's reflective of the knowledge base. So what I like to do in training is to be able to give them challenges and have them use the live knowledge base to solve those challenges by looking up the real answer, just as they would do once they've completed training and they're answering customer contacts, whether it's phone or email or chat or what have you. So a key component is to make sure you integrate that knowledge base into your training. Okay, so I want to share with you the third piece here. And this, I think, is what ties it all together and where your savings really comes about. And to do this, I want you to imagine your first call. And I say first call, I think with email, we have this time buffer where we can kind of erase, et cetera. Chat even, it's live, but again, there's a little buffer. We can collect our thoughts. But the call, that's real time. And I want you to think about your first call. You probably experienced it. A lot of our agents, when we train them, we call it, I used to call it vapor lock, where they would just get kind of stuck and they couldn't figure out how to get their way out of it. All the things that we trained them on, they did well in training, and now they kind of look like this person does in the picture. They're just stuck. And why is that? It turns out the way we've trained them actually slows them down, and we can change that with a different training approach. So technique number 3 is what I call scenarios, and let me explain them. What I mean by this. The old way of training that many contact centers still use today is, as a trainer, I would call this a building block approach or a chunking approach. And you'll recognize it this way. We train each topic separately. So we'll do a module on product knowledge. We'll do a module on how to use our various computer software programs. We'll do a module on customer service, a module on company policy. And so we do all these separate modules. And then the challenge becomes when we ask them to handle them all in real time, they're not really fully familiar with all of them. I mean, maybe they passed a quiz, a week ago, and now they have to recall all of that. And it contributes to that vapor lock where they just freeze, and it takes them a while to get comfortable. Some of you might even do side-by-sides, or sometimes we call it Y-jacking, because we literally, plug in to something called a Y-jack so we can hear at the other end of the call and have one person talk and the other person using the keyboard. But we're still splitting up the different tasks. And at some point, someone's got to be able to do all of them all at once. So that old way of training is actually very inefficient from an adult learning perspective. And a much more efficient way of doing it is something called scenario-based learning, where we try to have the training mimic the actual job performance as closely as possible. So let me explain how this works. What we do is we come up with scenarios that reflect the types of contacts that our agents are going to handle. And we arrange them from simple and most common to most difficult. And we start the training by having them role-playing the entire contact. And the training works by going very, very slow at first. The first time we do this, it's almost painfully slow for the learners until we get to the point where we're going exceptionally fast. And that typically happens within the first or second day. So let me give you an example. And I'm sorry that this is such an old example, but it's a very simple one. 20 years ago, when I was working in a contact center as a training supervisor, the most common and simple request that we had was I would like a catalog. Please send me a catalog. So what we would do with this scenario is from the very beginning, we would role play. How do you answer the phone correctly? How do you greet them? The customer says, I'd like a catalog. Well, what do you say in response to that? Now, I'm going to have to go into our computer system and create a new customer record. Here are the questions I need to ask the customer. Here's where I put that in. And it's very, very slow, but it's done in the same order that we would an actual contact. And at the end of the call, then we practice, is there anything else I can help you with? No, that's it. And then we sign off the call the way we expect them to sign off every call. So that's a very simple scenario. It takes a long time to role play just that one because they have to learn how to do all these different things. But here's where the magic happens. Now we go with the next scenario, which is a new customer wants to place an order for just one item. And so what we do in the very next scenario is we role play what we just learned, how to greet the customer, how to create a new customer record. And we add in one new piece, which is ordering one item. And then we again practice how to end the call. So now we're starting to drill down on the most commonly used skills over and over again in the context of how an actual contact will flow. And now the third most difficult or simple and most common would be an existing customer wants to place an order for a single item. Well, now we repeat how to answer the phone. In this case, the new content is looking up a customer record versus creating a new one, but they just learned how to place an order for a single item. So now we reinforce that again. And so you would see what happens is we continuously reinforce all of the skills in the same order they would use them on a contact. And we build fundamental skills much, much more quickly than we did if we used the building block approach. Now, this is where the knowledge base comes in. Instead of having you memorize all the answers, what I do then is, we start throwing more challenges at you. Okay, I've got a billing issue. And here's what happened. Well, now I'm role playing what I would say to the customer, but then I'm using the knowledge base in this scenario to bring up the answer in real time while I'm role playing this and provide the correct information. And as we do this over and over again, we've taught our agents that they don't have to know every answer. They just have to know how to get it from the knowledge base and get it quickly, which means I spend a lot less time training them and I have to give them a lot fewer scenarios to develop the same level of skills. So from an accelerated learning perspective, here's the entire formula again. Here's how we cut training by up to 50%. We start with performance objectives that clearly define what a fully trained person looks like. And that allows us to eliminate content that is unnecessary and focus on content that is absolutely essential. Most training programs that I've worked with had too much content, so we're going to eliminate stuff that isn't needed. The second part of that equation is a knowledge base. So instead of memorizing information, which is very inefficient and takes a lot of training time, we're just going to give them a tool that they can use to quickly get the correct answer. And then we're going to move from building blocks to scenario-based learning, where I'm going to train them to handle contacts in the same order that they would handle a live contact. And what happens, and the magic here is, after about a day or two, they start accelerating their pace in learning much faster than you can ever imagine. So it starts really slow, but it quickly gets very, very fast. And that's where we get our 50% reduction in training time. Now, if you're doing some of these already, maybe it's more like 25%, or in some cases, it's more than 50% if we have a lot of extra content involved where it's really, really complicated. Now, I do want to address one last thing, and that is maintenance. Even with this type of training, we need to do maintenance to keep people's skills sharp. So I want to give you a couple of tools that you can access. One of them is a workbook with 10 customer service training activities that you can use with your team. They're very focused. They're a lot of fun, but they all focus on one particular skill. And so you can use these at your huddles or regular team meetings. And then I realize I have a little typo on here. It should say weekly reminder, so I apologize for that. I'm going to send you one specific reminder once per week on customer service. And this is a way that a lot of contact center leaders keep their team sharp. So they use them for daily huddles or weekly stand-up meetings. It's just one email with one tip once per week. So I apologize for that little typo there. But the way you get both of those is text the word hidden to 66866. And if you're outside the United States, I think this also works in Canada. So if you're outside of the United States and Canada, just go to toistersolutions.com/hidden, and you can download it there. You'll get the workbook, and then you'll be asked to provide your email, and you'll start getting those weekly reminders. So I've shared with you a process that I've used multiple times. In a moment, I know we're going to get to your questions, but now we're going to turn it over to Micah Peters, who's the VP of Product Management at Procedureflow. And I know Micah is going to share with you an example of how specifically a knowledge base can be really effective. So Micah, let me turn it over to you now.
Perfect. Thanks, Jeff. I really appreciate your presentation, and it does tie really into what Procedureflow is all about. So I'm just going to share a couple of slides on, giving an overview of what we do, and then we can open it up to questions that people have and be really specific there. So Procedureflow grew out of a call center. There was an outsourcing company that was working for a large technical, it was Nortel basically, and old school too. It's back in the 90s. And this is Alejandro, who actually was part of that original work. And we recreated kind of a moment in the past and had a little photo shoot and had some fun with it. But essentially they had 8 weeks of training. They had a 900-page standard operating procedure binder. Everybody had stickers, little yellow stickies everywhere, trying to remind them on how to do certain things. And then there's stories about people walking by, ripping 30 pages out of the binder and putting 30 new pages in. So they had a disaster. They were missing SLAs. Nortel wasn't happy. The clients weren't, the customers they were talking to. And then there were stories about the agents actually crying in their cubicles as they were overwhelmed with those first couple of weeks in the center. And so in that pain, they had to innovate. They had to do something. And so Procedureflow was created out of that. And so, the tie-in here between what Jeff was talking about and what we do is we support those last two items that Jeff talked about. And so if I start with scenarios, what they did was they created this visual nature of the standard operating procedures that agents could guide themselves through, which I'll talk about in a second, instead of text. And so when we talk about number two, which is a traditional knowledge base, often we're talking about paragraphs of text and numbered steps and things like that. And they're hard to consume, especially if you're on the phone with a customer. And that was a big part of their challenge. It was paper at the time, but now it's just kind of moved to a digital format, and it's still the same struggle. And so in this slide here, you can see that we have a circle on the left. Obviously, you just kind of glance at it quickly and you know what that is. If you're probably avoiding reading the one on the right at all, which is kind of like my brain's going like, oh, I don't want to look at it. And so you have this description, a curved line with every point equal distance from the center. So if you didn't have the picture of the circle and you had to basically, create that in your mind, you're like, and you did that with 100 people, would you even end up with circles in the end? And so you can tell that the textual description of something versus a graphic one is a big difference. And so Procedureflow, instead of writing text, you have small hyperlink flowcharts. The shapes and the colors and the arrows provide a picture. They provide a visual that agents can navigate through very easily, starting with scenarios, breaking it down into probing questions after that, the procedure itself, and then the exception handling that you have to do. That basically ends up being a picture of a subject matter expert's brain that new people can feel comfort in, and you can give them to, as Jeff mentioned, right on day one. They can go in, you give them all the scenarios, and then you just start throwing scenarios at them, as Jeff mentioned, and you start with simple ones like billing questions and shipping delays and just stuff like that, and then you build them up to the harder and harder ones by just continuing to throw scenarios at them. And it also cuts through the first point in the sense of saying we don't want to overtrain them, so we put just what they need in the scenarios. The rest of Procedureflow as a product and a knowledge management, knowledge-based tool is about making sure that there's only one single version of the process. So some really cool features like side-by-side comparison. We have the ability for agents to make contributions and submit them into a queue and have them approved through a proper publishing channel so someone can say yes or no to those suggestions. All of that is very visual. And then we have reporting that shows you the paths that agents are taking, the scenarios they're driving through while they're on the phone with the customer. So you can average handle time coach them and see how long they spent in each section, maybe aggregate that data and see where everybody's slowing down the most. So in the end, what our aim is to have somebody come in off the street, have them totally proficient in way less than a month, and have them be, they might only be there for 12 months or 24 months depending on an industry average. And so we want them to be productive the entire time that they're in the center versus maybe, you know, that really long 6 to 12 months of trying to feel good in the work and then they're gone soon after that. And so these are some of the companies that have taken that journey with us. Lots of great stories. Wyndham Worldwide actually cut their training on back office work by 100%. So they didn't have the phone soft skills barrier, and they just introduced them to Procedureflow in the morning, live work by lunchtime. MB Power cut their assist calls where they put customers on hold and go inside and ask for help. They cut it 7,000 calls out, so they don't have any more assist line. They just go to Procedureflow to get what they need. Eastlink cut their average handle time by 70 seconds by just watching agents go through the flows and the scenarios and seeing where they slowed down and making some adjustments. And then lots of other great stories in there as well. And the numbers here and the percentages kind of reflect what Jeff was talking about, that as you create scenarios and as you give them on day one, allow the agents to experience the scenarios right from the start, it massively reduces the training and onboarding time, escalations, first call resolutions go up, you have average handle time coming down, and our customers report back, like Eastlink came back and said that they had you know, an 11% savings on their operational costs, which is really huge for them. And so that's a little bit about Procedureflow. We would love for you to visit the website, check out some of the videos like on the product page, sign up, you know, try the product, give us a chance to do a customized demo for you. So if you're interested in those heavily in those last 2 points of having a great knowledge management system that is different than text-based, that is difficult to read, and then having a better way to lay out your scenarios simultaneously, we're that product, and we'd love to talk to you and help you out. So that finishes out what I wanted to do, Jeff, and I know there's a couple of questions that are lining up, and so I'd love to get back to you and answering those questions.
Thank you so much, Micah. Can you see the questions that have popped up, Jeff? If not, I can read them off.
What, if you don't mind, why don't you go ahead and read them off? I don't want to click on the wrong page.
Sure. So we have one person that actually asked the first question, described a scenario. So let's say we complete training with all dependencies and then the agents take calls. Isn't this ABCD strategy within the first X days on the phone, post-training just nesting with measurements? So that's the first question.
Okay, so the answer is no, it's not. It's a completely separate idea from nesting. The ABCD model is a way of creating measurable learning objectives. And the training is done when people complete all of the learning objectives. So typically you have anywhere from 1 to maybe 5. 5 would kind of be the max. Different objectives that would tell us when they can complete all of these, training is done. Nesting is just one component that contact centers frequently use to help their new agents get all the way to the finish line. I can tell you though that in my experience, I've frequently cut nesting out completely. So nesting often happens, not always, but in many contact centers, it's been added as an intermediate step where we've done formal training and they're getting it, but we're not quite sure, and their regular supervisor doesn't have enough time to spend helping them, so we put them in this kind of limbo environment, and that's often where nesting is. Now, if you use nesting differently in your contact center, maybe this would not apply. The reason I've eliminated nesting is often we get to live calls so quickly, and it's done in a training environment with a trainer right there. It kind of simulates the same thing as nesting. It just happens a lot faster. Now, I'll give you something I wish I had discovered and had the technology when I was in a contact center. I discovered this about a year ago. I toured the UPS contact center in Las Vegas, and they took it to another level. Day one, new agent starts in their workstation, and they attend new hire training. The bulk of it happens at their workstation. So even if they're doing classroom training, for example, they're using tools like we're using today, Zoom, and other tools to allow the agent to do that training from the workstation they will be sitting at once they've graduated training. So they take it really to an extreme level. So nesting, again, it's a separate thing. You might still use it, but the ABCD objectives is really a way of evaluating, has this person been trained or not?
Okay, great. Thanks, Jeff. We've got a couple more. How much time do you spend on your scenario training? And do you use the same scenarios over and over again with every new hire, or do you come up with several different ones?
Okay, so two questions there. First, in terms of time, I think traditionally we've thought about time in kind of an arbitrary fashion, like let's give them 4 weeks of training or 6 weeks or 2 weeks. And with performance objectives, what we actually do is we work backwards. We say, what is the performance I need from this person to consider them fully trained? And then how long is it going to take to get there? And often when we look at time that way, we find we've been spending too much time, just not spending that time as wisely. And so with scenarios, it's not a matter of time per se. It's a matter of how many scenarios do I realistically need to get them to the point where they've accomplished the learning objectives. And if you look at it that way, that's usually where you find you spend a lot less time. If you give me 4 weeks for new hire training and I only need 3, I'm still going to take my 4, right? That's just how it works. So I would be careful about starting with a time in mind. I would instead work backwards. In terms of the scenarios, absolutely, you need to update them. Procedures change, new products happen. One of the most important things you need to do is have your training reflect the actual work that's done and how it's done. So if you implement a new procedure in your contact center, you should definitely update scenarios that are going to reflect that, especially if it's something that's used frequently by agents.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. We have one more here. Do you think these techniques can work for every company, or are there companies where these techniques won't work?
I always struggle with absolute questions like that because I don't know. I don't know every company or every situation. What I can tell you is that in every contact center I've seen that has used some of these techniques that I've kind of described as the older techniques that they've traditionally been around. So we don't really measure training. We don't have clear learning objectives. We ask people to memorize a lot of things. We train them using this chunking method. If those are the techniques you're using, then yes, these techniques that we've shared today will work very well. There are some barriers sometimes to how well they'll work. So I'll give you one barrier that frequently does come up and makes it more challenging, and that is your CRM system. So many CRM systems or customer service ticketing system or whatever you're using, many of them come with what we call a sandbox, which is an environment that mimics the live environment, but you can make changes to records and you don't actually blow anything up. That makes scenarios a lot easier. If you don't have that technical ability, it becomes a little bit more difficult to work around that, because what you don't want to do is give your new agents access to a live environment where they're changing actual customer records or adding in cases or tickets that don't actually exist and creating, problems for those customers or other people down the line. So you have to be a lot more careful, but I think you can still work around that. So hopefully that answers the question that maybe there's scenarios where it doesn't work. But if you're using some of these older training methods, I typically have always seen it as an opportunity to improve training, make it faster and better.
Okay, thanks so much, Jeff. I think that's all the questions we have today. If you guys have any other questions, about this webinar or about any of the topics we talked about today, you can reach out to either Jeff. I'll put some of his information on our follow-up emails. And also we have our team standing by right now on procedureflow.com. If you have a question right now you want to ask, you can get it answered live. If you know someone who wanted to attend this webinar today but was unable to, we will be sending the recording out, so you can feel free to share that with anyone you know who might be interested. And I just want to say thanks again to Micah and especially to Jeff for being here, for taking time out of your day to join us for this webinar. We really appreciate it, and I would highly encourage everyone to go check out Jeff's website. He's got a lot of awesome content on there.
I would
It's
say
my
as
pleasure.
well.
Thank you.
I'd say too, if you ever go to like a contact center trade show, Jeff's usually there, so you can check out his sessions as well.
That's it. If you're going to be in Chicago next week, 2 weeks from now at ICMI's Contact Center Connections, we'll be talking about the onboarding experience. So I hope to see some of you there. Thank you.
Awesome. Awesome.
Thanks everyone for joining. Have a great day.